Michael Knowles is on with us by phone today to talk to us about his new book, Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, about how the left is using language to control the culture and shape what they perceive to be reality. You're not going to want to miss this interview.
And he's on with us now by phone. Good morning to you, Michael Knowles.
Good morning. So great to be with you.
Praise be to God. It's good to have you on. Now, this is a book that has a few more words than your previous work. Tell us about the process of writing Speechless.
Well, my first work, of course, involved many years of research and about 10 seconds of writing. That was called Reasons to Vote for Democrats, a Comprehensive Guide. That, by the way, it did have some words in the extensive bibliography, though no other words in the book. And this book involved many, many more words. And I thought it would be ironic, since I wrote a book without any words, to then write my next book entirely about words and about the power of language to shape our culture and our politics, and specifically the strategies that the left, the radicals, have used to upend our culture through what we used to call political correctness. Now sometimes we call it wokeness or cancel culture. As you can see, the words change, but they refer to the same old scourge. And I think this is the most powerful tool that radicals and revolutionaries have used to upend our traditional society.
You know, I find it fascinating because we're in a digital age. You know, my medium of choice is radio, a medium that seems to be dying as digital grows and as the world is pushed really into this bright, beautiful, bold digital future. We see censorship on the rise, whereas on radio, we can say things without that censorship in a wholly different way. I find that fascinating. Have you thought about that in this sort of the passing of one age into the next?
Yes. The promise initially of talk radio was that you could get through the gatekeepers of the mainstream television and print media. And then when the new media came out, the social media, the digital age, people thought this will just be an extension of this new free speech age. And of course, what has happened is that over time, the big tech oligarchs came in and began to clamp down on speech. And the oligarchs, I refer to Jack Dorsey at Twitter as hipster Rasputin, you know, these left-wing billionaires in Silicon Valley, they really crossed the Rubicon on January 7th and January 8th when they deplatformed and censored even the duly elected sitting president of the United States. Shows you where power really lies, because in a republic such as ours, speech is politics, and politics is speech. We govern ourselves by communicating and persuading one another. So if you control speech, you really control the whole system. And I think, actually, that the mistake that so many conservatives have made in the past 30 years or so fighting against political correctness is we viewed this battle primarily as one between free speech on the one hand and censorship on the other. And I don't think that's quite right. I think it's actually much more a battle between competing sets of standards, namely the traditional standards of our culture and the anti-standard of the radicals. And so what you've seen is, in some ways, you're free to speak much more freely. All those 7 words that George Carlin said you could never say on TV, you can say them now, but you can't say plain facts like men are not women and babies are babies. Those things you'll be censored for. And so I think we've really fallen for this trap whereby we've abandoned our traditional standards, and because nature abhors a vacuum, the woke leftist standards have filled their place, and society's all the worse for it.
Yes, and I know Adrian Fonseca speaking, and this is, you know, I always kind of split up the division of it, not to just conservatives and progressives, but I break it into like 3 camps. You have the traditionalists who take on what has been handed down to them, literally from Tradare to hand on, and then the conservatives who want things to remain exactly how it is today, even though it's different, and the progressivists who are walking to the edge of the cliff. Why is it important to be a traditionalist rather than simply a conservative?
Well, Chesterton has a great line on this. He says it's the job of liberals to go about making mistakes and the job of conservatives to make sure those mistakes are never corrected. and I think that, yes, we want to look to something deeper, to something that is enduring, that is transcendent. So we do look to the tradition, and we do look to natural law, and we do look to reality. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to conserve very much of any of those things in recent years. I think the reason for this strange phenomenon that the harder we fight against political correctness, the more ground we seem to lose. I think it's because of this subtle trap. If political correctness really just seeks to destroy our tradition, then you'll notice there are only two ways that people have really fought back. Well, I suppose there's the one way, which is the squishes. They just give in to the new standards. It might take a little while to do it, but obviously that will advance political correctness. But then even the more stalwart people who say, I'm not going along with your new standard of speech, you'll notice very often they'll do that by abandoning standards entirely. They'll say you're free to say whatever you want to say, do whatever you want to do. And the trap is, either way you react advances political correctness because it abandons those traditional standards. And so I think you make a great point when we talk about the tradition. It is not merely enough to say, let's pause history here and stop everything from changing. Of course you can't do that. Another Chesterton observation is that when you leave a white picket fence out in the street, you're leaving it in a torrent of change. It won't remain white for very long. There will be bugs and dirt. Change is the constant. So what is it exactly that we want to stand for? What is it that we want to preserve? I think what a lot of people on the right have learned in recent years, and I hope they pick it up more quickly, is that the freedom of speech in the abstract is all well and good. The freedom of speech in the abstract doesn't mean anything for people who don't have anything to say.
Michael Knowles is our guest. His book is called Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds by Regnery. And, I was just watching an interview with Robert De Niro yesterday. It was like an actors roundtable kind of a thing. And they're talking about the craft of acting, and it was great. And then all of a sudden, we interrupt this conversation to bring you a rant against Donald Trump. And De Niro was going off. But what caught me off guard was how sort of violent his undertones were, that he wanted to snuff out, this person whom he could not stand, did not like their politics or their opinions. The left often gets away with that. They often get away with sort of promoting this violence, whereas on the right, if we dare to suggest it, boy, it would be the end of the world. Does your book cover that as well?
Well, it does, and it covers some of the reasons why, but we've got more proof of that even just this week. There's a new study out from UC Santa Barbara that shows that, and again, I take these studies with a grain of salt, but when they suit my purposes, I'm more than happy to cite them. And what this survey shows is that leftists are much more likely to dehumanize conservatives than the other way around.
Wow.
They focus their study specifically on the 2020 election. We've seen this on other social media surveys. Leftists are much more likely to unfriend someone over politics than conservatives are. And the reason for that, I think, is that conservatives or traditionalists or people broadly on the right generally understand where our opponents are coming from because that's the culture we live in. The left has so thoroughly dominated the institutions, the media, big tech, the schools, the government, that we know what they think. But unfortunately, our opponents don't really know what we think. And so it's easier to become violent and it's easier to use coercion. And I also think that it's important to recognize when the topic of speech comes up, we all use euphemisms, right? We refer to a woman of a certain age instead of an old hag, for instance, to be polite. We use language to soften harsh realities, but we don't undermine them. On the left, they actually do invert the reality, so they'll refer to same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage is not marriage. They'll refer to a trans woman. That is not a woman. There's a new bit of jargon. They'll refer to criminals as justice-involved persons, when, of course, those persons are involved in the opposite of justice. They're involved in injustice. I think it goes back to what the ex-communist Whittaker Chambers wrote. He said that communism, this kind of radicalism, is the great alternative faith of mankind. It's not a new thing, but it actually began in the Garden of Eden when the serpent told Eve, "Ye shall be as gods." This desire to redefine reality itself by redefining all the words, I think that's at the heart of this semantic strategy that they have. And I think it's why, by the way, the left is putting so much emphasis on the pronouns, trying to get us to refer to Bruce Jenner as she and her, because that is an attempt to redefine not even just the political situation, but nature itself. And it's why they become so irate when we don't go along with their plans, because we believe that there is such a thing as reality, there is such a thing as objective truth, and it's not going to change no matter how much you want to redefine it.
Yes, and I really like what you're saying here about this, and the actual title "Speechless" tells a lot about what we're discussing. Because I'm thinking of Aquinas and Augustine. You know, Augustine gives the analogy of God the Son being the word spoken, the divine logos, and Aquinas talks about how when you deny truth, but when you lie, which is political correctness, when you lie, you are denying Christ Himself because He is truth. Could you tell what is the relationship between truth and political correctness?
Well, political correctness seeks to contradict truth and to deny it altogether. You see this, and I trace the movements in Speechless going back not just to the 80s, but really going back to the 1920s, and the very brilliant, albeit perverse, leftist radicals who developed this plan. And then in the 1960s and 70s, you saw the proliferation of academic theories that seem to suggest that reality is just a social construction. It's just words, 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 which is, by the way, what Hamlet says when he's pretending to be insane. Now we've actually gone insane, so we believe that to be true, that there's no underlying reality here. And you see this in critical theory, critical race theory, postmodernism, all of these various isms that suggest that we can just define not even just the world, but even our very human nature. And you can go back even further than St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine, all the way to good old Uncle Aristotle, who says that man is the political animal because we have speech, right? It's not just grunting sounds where we grunt and yell and club each other over the head. Increasingly, that's what politics looks like, but it's not how it should be. Actually, because we can observe reality, we can perceive it, we can know something about it, and then we can articulate what we believe about it in comprehensible terms, or in these symbols, which are words. Because we can do that, we are higher than the other animals, and we can have a political society. But when that breaks down, when you disconnect society from that reality, then you're not going to be able to have a civil politics. I'm reminded of my friend George Rutler, who points out that when a society no longer identifies itself with I am that I am, the name God gives Himself, the essence of being, then you're left with this pitiful question, who am I? And you try, like a teenager, you try on various silly identities. That's what we're doing right now, and I think reality is reasserting itself. But the battle is between those, I think, who believe there is such a thing as truth and will defend it, and those who want to make their own truth, which is actually an inversion of the truth.
Michael Knowles is our guest. His book is called Speechless. It's published by Regnery. Michael, we've had on our program a couple of times now Dr. Paul Kengor. He's got an excellent book called The Devil and Karl Marx. And some of what you're saying kind of reminds me of our conversation we've had with him. And one of the things that surprised me was how quickly after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, in Russia, how quickly that translates into active communist work in the United States, especially within the teachers union and other aspects of American society. In Catholic circles, we'll often talk about this in terms of the infiltration. Bella Dodd's name comes up and all of that. One of the things that comes to mind looking at your book, Speechless, and listening to you talk about it was how the left seems to want to spin every criticism, every pushback, especially in terms of Marxism, communism, the sort of the critical race theory, for instance, as sort of like a tinfoil hat moment, like a conspiracy theory. Well, like former President Obama, you know, he would criticize us for, like we've got nothing else to talk about other than critical race theory. You people are crazy. You know, where is at what point do we get to in the timeline where we have lost the ability to look at the circumstances and call a spade a spade?
Well, you know, I love Paul Kengor's book, The Devil and Karl Marx, so much that I actually wrote the foreword to that book, and I quote that book in my own. I do trace the Marxist origins of this thing going back to the 20s, and I don't think that anyone is going to be able to accuse me or my readers of wearing tinfoil hats, because I have about 100 pages of notes and citations. So I hope that it's not too dry. You know, I worry it's almost too much on that side. But I think it will protect us from any accusations of conspiracy theorizing. It's funny, you'll notice this with critical race theory right now. the radicals who push that stuff will alternately defend critical race theory and then deny that it even exists. And you say, well, hold on a second, which is it? You can't do both of those things simultaneously. Ultimately, I think the radicals are pushing this craziness, and they've been pushing it for a very long time. But a lot of the fault actually lies with people on the right who have failed to take a strong stand here. The communism is a good example in this. In the 1950s, you could be canceled, and often would be canceled, for being a communist. There was a Hollywood blacklist. You could be prosecuted on that. Today, you can be canceled for not being a communist. And so what has changed is not the fact that there is a cancel culture. What has changed is the standard by which one can be canceled. And I think conservatives need to ditch the shallow slogans of free speech absolutism that have cropped up in recent years. And I think we need to recognize all societies have standards. All societies have taboos. Some things will always be off limits. That's always been true in America, and it's been true everywhere else in the world, too. And I think we need to be able to articulate a substantive moral vision of politics that, it's true that political correctness prevents you from saying certain things. So does chivalry. I mean, so do all speech standards. And so, contrary to conservative self-flattery, I think that the left actually understands speech and its relation to politics and censorship much better than conservatives do. And that's true going back to Marx, and certainly true of Marx's ideological heirs, from Antonio Gramsci all the way up to the present Looney Tunes who are trying to reshape our speech regime. And we need to get the courage, which is not just a virtue, but a prerequisite for all of the other virtues, the courage to state some things are true, some things are false, some things are right, some things are wrong. And we need to encourage the former, the true and the good, and we need to suppress the latter. That is what politics does. And right now, we've unilaterally disarmed and surrendered our politics to the radicals who want to reshape it.
Yeah, there's two little threads that I want to pick up, and I don't know which one to grab. I think the one thing is the relationship between there. You often hear people say the political correctness is the new Inquisition, which is an absurd comparison because the political correctness attacks good things and the Inquisition attacks evil things. But more to the point, I'm 6 chapters into your book, and on chapter 6 of your book, you were talking about the tolerant left, and I was surprised that you didn't actually include a reference to Fulton Sheen's famous essay, A Plea for Intolerance. And I want to read the first paragraph, and because I've talked about this all the time. I love this essay of his, and I want to read you the first paragraph and get your comments on it. America, it is said, is suffering from intolerance. It is not. It is suffering from tolerance. Tolerance of right and wrong, truth and error, virtue and evil, Christ and chaos. Our country is not nearly so overrun with the bigoted as it is overrun with the broad-minded. Your thoughts?
It's a beautiful statement. I took the chapter from the left's point of view. So there's an infamous essay by the father of the New Left, who himself was one of the early critical theorists, Herbert Marcuse, and it's called Repressive Tolerance. And in it, he says you cannot tolerate intolerance, and he uses this as just a way to shut up conservatives and encourage leftist speech. And I used that essay because conservatives are so quick to dismiss it and to deride it, but he's making the same point, actually, that Fulton Sheen is making. He's making it from a really perverse sort of perspective. But both of them make the observation that, the truth is arrogant. They both make the observation that you cannot tolerate everything. Words themselves exist to discriminate one thing from another thing. There was a commercial that came up the other day from the NFL, and it said, football is gay, football is transgender, football is everything. And I said, well, it can't be everything. It's not, football is not basketball, football is not baseball, and even if it were to be gay or transgender, those views take on opposite premises about human nature. We actually must be able to discern between good and bad and right and wrong. There was I guess you'd say former conservative columnist, now he's pretty decidedly on the left, David French, who in a debate with Sohrab Ahmari, a Catholic conservative writer, he referred to Drag Queen Story Hour as one of the blessings of liberty. That sound you hear, by the way, is James Madison rolling over his grave.
Right. That's disgusting.
He said, now his argument, I want to be as charitable as one can be to David's argument. He says, effectively, if you tell perverts that they can't twerk for little toddlers at the public library, why then they might tell Christians that we can't go to Mass on Sunday. And so I say, first of all, they were already telling us that for the past year and a half. So just
Yep.
at the practical level, that sort of fails. But also, if you really believe that we cannot discern between a pervert jiggling for a kid and a pastor preaching the gospel, that's fine. But then what you're telling me is you do not have faculties of reason, you do not have a moral conscience, and you are not capable of self-government, because self-government relies on your reason and on your conscience. This is why when John Adams says the country is built for a moral and religious people, this is not soft soap and superstition. He's just making an observation about politics, that you need those things in order to govern yourself. There's one of these silly slogans that's cropped up in recent years. They say, you can't legislate morality, which is preposterous because you necessarily legislate morality. All laws, whether you're talking about abortion or you're talking about parking tickets, they all make moral arguments. They refer to the moral law. And so I think conservatives just have not had the courage, or perhaps even the vision, to articulate what we want society to look like and how it ought to be. And that's fine, but then you are surrendering your role in politics. And I think this is why the left has had basically ceaseless victories for the past several decades, regardless of who wins the elections.
Michael Knowles is our guest. Speechless is his book. Regnery Publishing has put it out. Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, which reminds me of something we were talking about on our program live on the radio today. And that is sort of this disconnect between reality and the things that the people in power, the ones that try to manipulate thought, opinion, words, and all of that. There seems to be a complete disconnect between everyday life on the streets and the things that they say and are trying to push upon us. Is that a part of this history of manipulating words and manipulating minds? Because it just boggles the mind to watch them speak on national television and then go, what world do they live in? Because that is not at all what I see going on in front of me.
Yes, this is the great consolation, actually, is that, and actually the Mac Daddy of political correctness, Antonio Gramsci, he was a radical revolutionary, a communist party founder in Italy. He discovered that the reason that the Marxist revolutions had failed is because the revolutionaries did not have a hold of the common sense. They had lots of prescriptions for how to liberate the oppressed masses, but the oppressed masses didn't like those theories very much. And so he understood that they had to be liberated from their false consciousness, and the radicals needed to attain cultural hegemony through a rule of position. These are all technical terms, but they describe the process by which the radicals had engaged in what was later called the Long March through the institutions to gain positions of power, whereby, even though they were small in number, they could exert a huge political influence. And that is what they have done. Ernest Hemingway, in Sun Also Rises, describes going bankrupt as a process that happens gradually, then suddenly. And I think we were in the gradual phase for much of the 20th century, and now we are in the suddenly phase of that. You're seeing people push back, the common people across races, across demographics. They're showing up to their school boards and saying, we don't want radical racial theories in our schools. We don't want radical gender theories in our schools. Don't tell my little 4-year-old boy that he's a little girl. That's a very good thing. And you're seeing the ruling class, the ruling elite now, sneering at them, as they often have, calling them bitter clingers, deplorable, irredeemable. They don't even know what critical race theory is, they claim. No, I think the common people know quite a lot more. And so if conservatives or traditionalists can hold on to that, can defend that against the predations of the ruling elite, I think we have a glimmer of hope. But that will involve taking their side and really putting forward a moral vision. And I'm not sure that many leading conservatives are willing to do that.
You mentioned earlier, I want to go back to talking about the sexual confusion today. It's something I harp on quite a bit, the Drag Queen Story Hours. I go out with the TFP, the American Defense for Tradition, Family, and Property, to help protest drag queen shows and all these things, because it's the tip of the spear attacking society. And in your book, you mention the relationship between the Albigensian heresy and the modern sexual confusion. The cure for the Albigensian heresy, other than the Crusades, was the wielding of the Holy Rosary by Holy Father Dominic and his Hounds of the Lord, the Dominicans. Do you think that the preaching of the Rosary will be the cure to the modern-day Albigensian heresy?
It actually had not occurred to me, even as I pray my nightly rosary. But I suppose, so often the answer is to recognize that while we may do what we can, and we ought to do what we can, ultimately, prayer, and in particular the Rosary, which has saved civilization on more than one occasion, beyond the Albigensians, let's not forget the Battle of Lepanto, we really must turn to God, and we must pray to the Blessed Mother, and these things can be extraordinarily effective. And but we need those Dominicans too. We need those, the hounds of the Lord defeated that first heresy, and there's nothing new under the sun. But we do need people to go out there and preach the truth and suppress this kind of error, because the error of Gnostic dualism showed itself in Albigensianism, it showed itself in Marcionism, showed itself in Manichaeism. I mean, this seems to crop up over the centuries, and unfortunately, the historically illiterate left does not seem to recognize that. They think that they've stumbled on some new truth, that in the case of transgenderism, our body has nothing to do with who we really are. And that's, of course, preposterous. But notice their account. On the one hand, they push transgenderism, which says that the physical world, our bodies, have nothing to do with who we really are. On the other hand, they push materialism. They tell us we don't have a soul, that our loves and our dreams and our hopes are nothing more than just accidents of pistons firing off in our head, and we're all meat puppets who will turn to worm food someday. They push materialism. And those are opposite explanations of human nature, but they both contradict the reality of the human person, which is that we're body, soul, and spirit. It seems to often be the case. The left will vacillate between contradicting ideas so long as they upend the traditional understanding of society and of the human person. So I think it's important for us not just to tamp down, like a whack-a-mole, the crazy new ideas that are cropping up, but actually to make a substantive defense of what we really believe. We've had this shallow proceduralism on the right, especially over the last 20 or so years, where we defend free speech and freedom of belief in the abstract. But we need to know what it is exactly that we believe. And so much of the debate going on the right now, I think, is about that. Well, we will either stand for the good, the true, and the beautiful, or we will fall for anything. And we've engaged in the latter for far too long.
Absolutely. And I think the Rosary in particular is a great defense against this, because in meditating upon, like, for the sorrowful mysteries of the Holy Rosary, you think about the humanity of Christ, the tearing of his flesh, and how suffering is good, for one. That teaches you one thing. The second thing, that the body is not evil, because it's something that's glorious, and we see in the joyful mysteries. But then in the glorious mysteries, we see the resurrection of the body. We see that it's not just simply a ghost in the shell. And then we see the coronation of Our Lady as Queen of Heaven and Earth. So we raise woman and promote what a woman actually is. So we know what a man is, we know what a woman is, we know what the body is, we know what the soul is, we know the importance of a hylomorphic creature of the body and soul composite. I find it very fascinating how this completely solves the theologically and philosophically the errors of today.
And of course, the physicality of the sacramental itself, of the Holy Rosary or of your scapula, reminds you that we do live in time and space. This is a real world. We're not just free-floating minds without bodies. So that's very important. And I do think, especially now that we have prayed the sorrowful mysteries yesterday, it is important to remember that being shut up on Twitter is bad, but people have suffered more than that in history. The martyrs have, and our Lord certainly has suffered more than that, and we can bind ourselves to that. And I'm reminded of St. Charles Borromeo, his visit up to heaven, his visit down to hell, and his visit to Calvary, where we see our Lord bleeding on the cross because of the sin that he is redeeming us all from, our own sin. And you think, well, the least we can do is stand up and say that a man is not a woman. The least we can do is attest in even the most basic way to that truth, which has redeemed us all, and which is the only way that we will be set free. Such a hideous error of transgenderism is this emotional manipulation, where they will tell you on the left that if you do not tell Bruce Jenner that he really is a woman, that you're being very cruel to him. And the premise here applies beyond transgenderism. It means that lies are liberating and that the truth is cruel. And of course, the reality is the opposite. Lies are disrespectful and cruel, and the truth will set you free.
Michael Knowles is our guest. And Michael, I was just thinking, about what we're full on papist at this point in the conversation. I mean, there's no getting out of it. But
mackerel snappers, absolutely.
What I find interesting about this is, I mean, you're a guy who works with some pretty famous, or as some would say, infamous non-Catholics and non-Christians even. You probably have a good portion of your audience who are not Catholic. How are they responding to? You seem to apply your Catholic thought and spirituality to your work and to your thoughts, especially on politics and society and culture. Are you receiving any pushback for that? And if you could, you can share that with us.
I will occasionally receive some pushback, sometimes from atheists, sometimes from my Protestant listeners and colleagues who are confused about various aspects of the faith. So they'll be confused about. Usually, they're not arguing against Catholicism; they're arguing against some preposterous bumper sticker slogan representation of Catholicism. So they'll ask why we worship the saints and things like that. And I'm more than happy to answer those questions because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's some pretty weak catechesis, by the way, in various parishes. So I'm more than happy to answer those questions as best I can. But one thing that I am noticing is there is a bit more solidarity than there is division among Christians and even among theists more broadly, including Jews and Muslims, because we recognize that the threat to our civilization at the moment, I don't think it's the Jews, I don't think it's the Muslims, despite the wars with Islamic terrorists over the past few decades. I think the most dire threat is from the secularism within, this hideous anti-religious, anti-intellectual bigotry that will kick all of religion out of public life. There, I think one needs a bit of solidarity because what we take to be now neutral secular liberalism is anything but. It's not neutral at all. The one book you're not allowed to teach in schools is the Bible. It's the most important book ever written. Even if you were an atheist or you thought you were an atheist, surely you would have to admit that the rest of Western literature doesn't make any sense if you don't understand the Bible and if you haven't read the Bible. So it is a bit bizarre that's speech code. That's a banned book in our public schools. You are not permitted to have school prayer anymore. Again, this is not from the beginning of the country. This is only within the last 50 or so years, and I think it was a very intentional and brilliant and clever scheme to upend traditional society. In the words of the 1619 Project, to reframe our society. In the case of that project, they want to put slavery at the center of it. And in the broader sense, they want to take God out of the center of that. So, I'm always so pleased when people will write into the show and say, Michael, I've become Catholic. I used to be Methodist or something, or I used to be Muslim, but now I'm, I don't know, whatever the.
And it's all your fault. Which reminds me of the follow-up question to that is, what about controlling words and minds within the church? That's something we're struggling with now, is some of the manipulations that happen among the hierarchy of the faithful. We saw this during the pandemic. We see this during political correctness, the abuse crisis, and so much more. What about that?
I'm always reminded of Hilaire Belloc's line that he has to take it as a matter of faith that the church is divinely instituted, but for non-believers, one bit of evidence of that divine institution is that no other institution conducted with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight. You're certainly seeing that in aspects of the episcopacy. Although the bishops, as a bit of a silver lining here, a little bit of hope, they do appear to have at least begun to articulate some objection to the fact that we have this heretical president.
Yeah, but they got to get Whoopi Goldberg's permission, so I'm not sure that's going to work.
Yeah.
I know we might not want to hold our breath just yet.
Yeah, maybe not.
But this is something that is very important to understand. That when you hear our leftist friends take a line from, for instance, Pope Francis, whether he was quoted honestly or dishonestly, it sort of doesn't even matter. They'll say, see, now the church is going to change its views on, marriage or on abortion. And what they don't understand is that the church cannot change her views on something such as marriage or something such as abortion. It's not possible to contradict that truth. And the church, just by spirit of the divine protection, and also just historical inertia, is not as susceptible to change as so many other institutions are. But there are people who are trying to do that, and they don't understand that some things must remain eternally true. I mean, that sense of just a bedrock of reality has fallen away in many places, even on the right. And so I think we can look to Mother Church to teach us something about that, but we've also got to make sure that we keep in line those people within Mother Church who are trying to change it. My favorite writer is Dante, and I always go back to Dante. And Dante can be a little tough sometimes on the episcopacy, but there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it's perfectly appropriate.
Absolutely. What is the famous quote? The road to hell is paved with the skulls of bishops. But yes, it kind of reminded me when you're talking in your book, you mentioned the revolution constantly, and we're talking about uniting the clans against the revolution. Professor Plinio, the founder of the TFP, he described the situation as, if the revolution is disorder, then the counter-revolution must be a return to order. And, I'm thinking about this, and you also quote in your book how reality tends to reassert itself. And I think that we're seeing this at the same time. Could you speak on how the revolution is chaos, is disorder, and how the counter-revolution, which is us, Catholics, the Christian society, everyone who has a right head, can battle against and become the counter-revolution, which is a return to order?
Yes. I think this is the most important thing that Republicans and conservatives need to correct themselves on. Especially in the 1980s and 90s, it became fashionable for conservatives to portray themselves as the wild ones, writing, which was certainly amusing, from people like P.J. O'Rourke, the Republican Party reptile. You would drive fast on drugs and not spill your drink, and we're just for freedom. I don't know. I think this involves a redefinition of liberty as license. But they would say, we want you to say whatever you want, do whatever you want. Just don't make me pay for it. Just don't bother me. Stay off my lawn. And that is not a serious political vision. It plays into the hands of the left, and it will. With conservatives like that, no one would need a radical.
Right. We
need to recognize that there are limits. We are saying that some things are out of bounds. You should not simply say whatever you want, whatever you want. You should not simply do whatever you want, whenever you want. You should discipline yourself, and you should, in order to have real liberty, you need to suppress your basest impulses. I think this is the biggest misunderstanding probably in politics today, is we've accepted, even on the right in many quarters, the modern liberal definition of liberty, which is doing whatever you want whenever you want to do it. But the classical definition of liberty, the Christian definition of liberty, is that liberty is the right to do what you ought to do. Lord Acton even makes this point, that the man who sins is a slave to sin. So through liberal education, we learn to tamp down our appetites, our base will, and discipline our will toward our rational will, right? Our higher intellect. And this is why when St. Paul says, the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things that I don't do, I want to do. This is not a contradiction here. We have our lowest will, and that is hopefully brought underneath our rational will. And the rational will mediates between the appetite and the divine will. And we used to know that, but we no longer do. And so I think returning to true liberty, as our founding fathers saw it and as wise statesmen have always understood it, is going to require the word no. It's going to require suppressing a lot of things. It's going to require limits, just like a poem requires limits in order to be beautiful. So too do societies in order to have that true higher liberty.
Michael Knowles is our guest. His book is called Speechless, published by Regnery. It is Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. And I want to say it's in reprint, and that's good news. Praise be to God. Wasn't it just the other day that someone was asking President Biden what is American, and he struggled to answer? What would you say to that question, Michael Knowles? What makes an American? What is America?
Well, Biden, he just retreated into this nominalist sort of position. He said, well, what does it even mean? What could America mean? He said, Americans, we don't share a race, we don't share a religion, We believe that in an idea, and the idea is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Pause it right there. I thought Joe Biden told me we don't share a religion. But then he told me the thing we do share that makes us American is that we believe that God endowed us with unalienable rights. That sounds pretty religious to me, Buster. Obviously, the president seems to be confused about a great many things these days. But no, there is a religious aspect to America. If you deny that God endows people with certain unalienable rights, you are cutting yourself off from the American tradition. If you don't speak English, you're going to have a difficult time in America. We speak English, at least for now in this country, so that would be a defining feature. If you live within the borders, I know the borders are falling away, but if you live within the borders, that would be one aspect of what would make you an American. The left is trying to knock down all distinctions between men and women, between human and non-human, between our country and every other country in the world. But this is why the immigration issue is so important. On one level, because citizens have a right to determine who gets to come into the country, but also because a nation is defined by its borders, and a people is defined by its borders. It's certainly the case that there are many different races, nationalities in this country, come from different places, arrived in this country at different times in their family's history. But there are defining features, and the move by the president and his followers to deny that anything could define an American is to deny that there is any such thing as America. We're all just kind of the same, man. We're all just citizens of the world. There's a move to do that right now, but that would be just by definition the very death of America.
You were commenting on this the other day, and I found it incredibly fascinating, and I wanted to get you to articulate this again. It kind of relates. In jest, people refer to Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, and then they add to it the unknown knowns. And you made a great point of how the joke actually proves more than one might think. Could you speak on that?
Yes. Yeah, the people always made fun of Rumsfeld. I thought it was one of the most intelligent statements that any American statesman has made in a great many decades. The known knowns are the things that you know, or simply put. The known unknowns are the things that you know they're out there, you've got to figure something out, but you just don't know quite what that is. The unknown unknowns are very dangerous because you're really floating free and flying blind. And then there's a fourth category, actually, that the Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek pointed out. He referred to it as the unknown knowns, the things that you know that you don't know that you know. And this we would probably call ideology, or this might be the cliches that fill our minds that George Orwell warned us about, that if you don't want to think for yourself, just open your mind up to cliches. They will flood into your head, and they will do your thinking for you. And I think there's a whole lot of that going on right now. And unfortunately, we no longer seem to possess the philosophical or theological sophistication to even know what we're talking about. We were talking about the transgender issue earlier. Today, if you question the claim that Bruce Jenner is now a woman, the only reason that is ascribed to you is your hateful bigotry and malice against sexually confused people. And this gets to, again, that study showing the dehumanization by the left of the right. Well, if there were some sophistication here, if we were even aware of the ideology that is defining our culture, and notably people on the left, if they were aware of that, we could begin to change it. So what we have to do, ironically, is raise the consciousness, liberate ourselves from a false consciousness, to use all that Marxist jargon, because what the left has done very successfully, and especially during the 1970s when the feminists redefined the personal as the political. They said all of our personal relationships, even husband to wife, who does the dishes, that's now political, it's open to public scrutiny. Well, it was a brilliant tactic. There really was a private sphere. Then it really did become political. Now everything is political, from our sneakers to our chicken sandwiches, ironically, except for our politics. That's all decided by Dr. Fauci and the various other bureaucrats in Washington. But they really did upend all of that. And I know that a lot of us long for that private realm again, for that realm that's really cut off, and it's not everything is political, and we can just watch football and not be bombarded with Marxist slogans. But the only way that we're going to resettle that is by winning the political battle. And then when there is a consensus again, when we agree on certain things, then we will be able to exist in that personal realm. But we will need to render the unknown knowns known again. And kudos to the late Mr. Rumsfeld for calling that to our attention.
Michael Knowles is our guest. We're getting to the end of our conversation with him about Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds by Regnery Publishing. And I want to take you through sort of a thought experiment for a moment. I want you to imagine, Michael Knowles, that you are an outside observer. Pretend like you're one of these aliens now that we have this very clear, precise document from the federal government about what these secretive crafts are, these UFOs. So pretend you're one of these aliens. And you are looking at this country who is dissolving its own borders, who is controlling thoughts through manipulation, through things like critical race theory or what have you, burning its own cities down and doing all of these sort of crazy ideas. What conclusions would you begin to draw as to why are they doing this and what is the end goal of all of this?
I would probably urge the Americans in my Martian language to check their premises. You know, I don't think the situation is so simple as returning to the 1950s, say. I think if we return to the 1950s, we'd end up right in the same place that we are right now. I think that the errors go back a little bit further. And the errors begin with a kind of, especially on the right, with this radical skepticism, this feeling that one cannot articulate a vision of the good and the true and the beautiful because who is to decide? Who is to decide? You hear this very often when people say, we need standards, we need to kick out drag queen story. They say, well, who is to decide what we kick out? And my answer is, well, you and I would be a good start, don't you think? I think we're relatively reasonable people. I think we ought to be able to do that. So I think the problem goes back much further. The problem may lie even in the origins of liberalism. There might have been a way to turn liberalism a little bit better, or we might need to have corrected it from the very beginning. I look back at people like John Locke, the father of liberalism. In his letter concerning toleration, he says we can't tolerate everyone, we can't tolerate atheists. There needs to be some basis of society. John Milton writes Areopagitica, it's the most famous defense of free speech in the English language. He says we can't tolerate Catholics, actually, is what he says. Thankfully, that standard went away. But he was making a political point, about political turmoil and religious fighting in England. There needs to be some order, some society in order even to have the free speech regime. I might go back a little bit further. I suggest reading St. Pius X. Dare I suggest reading Pope Leo XIII or Blessed Pius IX. The errors of modernity, I think, have flowered, and that's why you're seeing the people who developed modernity now hating themselves and tearing down their own country. Well, maybe we need to dig in a little bit further, and ultimately I think that would involve digging into the ancestral faith that built our entire civilization, the one true church. I think you will find some answers there, but you're as Cardinal Manning pointed out, all human conflict is ultimately theological. So I would tell those humans, check your premises and figure out what is the real essence of being on which your society is going to be built and which will sustain your society so long as it shall be sustained.
But do you see the end goal as something similar to communism, sort of a dystopian, atheistic, state that locks down thought, locks down actions, similar to North Korea or even CCP China?
Sure, it will, and call it collectivism if you like, but it's not the opposite of the hyper-individualism. I think they're two sides of the same coin, and I think much of the error that people have made is in fighting the collectivists, the communists, and others. They've descended into this politics that would maximize individual autonomy and say that, my ability to mutilate my own body is the height of individual expression. Well, no, the way that collectivists collectivize is by grouping up all of those atomized individuals who have no barriers to stopping such an action. Really what we must do is reject both of those false anthropologies, both of those false views of society, and defend, for instance, the family, the actual building block of society, the actual fundamental political unit. It's not, the family is very resistant to modern hyper-rational ideologization, but it's very durable, and that, I think, is a much church what you really believe to be true.
Michael, we have about 8 minutes left in our conversation, and I have a couple of questions left, but let me just do this one just in case we don't have time for it at the end. Your critics say that you're trying to solve a Protestant problem with a Catholic solution. Is that true, and why would that be a bad thing?
I'm trying to solve the Protestant problem with a Catholic solution, as I told my friend Andrew Clavin. No, I mean, I see his point. I think it's an astute observation, and I think he's getting at what we were just discussing, that maybe there's just this problem goes to the heart of the country. And Drew says this, by the way, as a Protestant. For now, we have not dragged him across the Tiber yet. But, very simply put, if there's going to be a solution, it's going to be a solution that is true, regardless of one's own misconceptions. So I don't think we're going to have to try to find if the error lies in some aspect of the Protestant Revolution, then we're simply going to have to correct that error. If the error lies in some aspect of liberalism, we're going to have to correct that error. I don't think we're going to be able to keep putting Band-Aids over problems for a long time. And so the solutions that I'm offering obviously derive from a Catholic epistemology, because I think that happens to be true. And if something that I've suggested is untrue, then people are more than welcome to point that out. But if we are going to solve the problem, then I don't think that indulging in various errors, no matter how modern or fashionable or comfortable, is really going to do it. As C.S. Lewis pointed out in a different context, if you look for truth, you might find comfort in the end. But if you look for comfort, you'll find neither truth nor comfort, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin, and in the end, despair.
Andrew Clavin was making the point that it seems like you're promoting some kind of Catholic integralism. So what are you exactly promoting in your book?
Well, I'm more than happy to live in the empire of Our Lady of Guadalupe and have fly that wonderful standard. But something tells me that won't be happening anytime soon. And so I'm not calling for some radical Catholic invasion of the country. Frankly, the Catholics invaded during the Italian immigration waves of the 1920s, and they never got rid of us. What I'm calling for is a more modest solution, and it's one that is so neglected these days. It's prudence. It's what Edmund Burke, the great conservative philosopher, called for. It's looking to the American tradition and looking at what has worked and how it has worked and trying to build upon that. I know that today it's fashionable to pretend that any curtailment of any behavior or speech is somehow illegitimate and anti-American. But that's just preposterous. From the very beginning of our country, whole swaths of speech were off limits. Threats, fraud, obscenity, fighting words. And today, a lot of those things are no longer enforced, especially obscenity. But if we want to return to a serious society, as we had for a long time, then I think we can go back and look what has worked. Even just the reinstitution of laws against obscenity. We were enforcing these at the federal level as recently as a dozen years ago. So if we just went back and said, no, certain things, some vile kind of pornography, it's really not protected. And we actually can know, thank you, Justice Potter, we can know it when we see it. It's not just a punchline. You actually can know when something is just vile and disgusting and obscene. Even as recently as the 1990s, by the way, you had Republicans and Democrats in the Congress, the Senate, and the White House passing laws against prurient content, even tougher prohibitions than obscenity standards on the internet. We can do that sort of thing. I don't think you need to call for the Pontifex invasion to do that. You can look back to, the Clinton years for guidance. I mean, if we're talking about something as modest as looking back to Bill Clinton, for goodness sakes, I don't think that should be too radical for anybody.
Yes, I have a couple more questions, but I'm going to end with one more question and let you, and then we'll wrap up there. One thing I found incredibly fascinating in your book that I had never heard before, because a lot of your ideas, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I've been trying to say for a while. But this particular, your euphemism treadmill that you talk about, that was incredibly fascinating to me because I had never heard that, and it rung so true. Could you speak briefly about the euphemism treadmill?
Yes. So there are all sorts of words that just seem to keep changing. And Steven Pinker at Harvard developed this idea of the euphemism treadmill, that when certain undesirable states of being, say, or defects are described, that the word to describe them inevitably takes on a negative connotation, and so people want to change the word. So the notable one would be a mental handicap. The word has changed over time from simpleton to idiot to moron to retard to mentally challenged to whatever the euphemism is today, because it's describing a difficulty, something from which people suffer, and so the word is going to continue to change. And the argument, this is true in all sorts of areas of language, and so the idea here of the euphemism treadmill is that the reality of what is being described will reassert itself no matter how bright and colorful the new euphemism is, and it will change the way that euphemism is perceived, and so you need a new one. And my argument is, yes, that is true, but this is not a cause to just lie back and wait for reality to reassert itself, because I think that the euphemisms will also exert some effect on the perception, even if they keep changing. I think it's not so simple as waiting around for reality. And so it's a much more complex process. It's why the left has been very successful, because they've managed that process very well. And it's why we've got to fight against euphemisms that don't just soften or be polite, but actually invert that reality, because I think that over enough time they will gain ground and reality might show itself. But we've got to be very careful, because people's perception can really be crafted by clever wordsmiths, as has been the case for 100 years now.
All right, Michael Knowles, you've been ducking this question for far too long. I think we should just get right to it as we wrap up our conversation here about speechless, controlling words, controlling minds. Aliens, are they really green men from outer space? Are they a secret three-letter government project? Are they the enemy? Or are they diabolic manipulation of minds? Michael Knowles, what say you?
I am most inclined to believe that they're just blips on radar that aren't real, for people
Thank
seeing
you.
things and hallucinating.
Well, that was anticlimactic.
Thank you, is what I've been saying.
But I don't want to duck it. By the way, by the way, you're not allowed to use the term alien anymore to refer to foreign.
So thank you.
So
I will scourge myself in reparation. Thank you.
But I will say, to give a little more definitive of an answer, I do not believe in the little green men. You hear all the time from the real leftist scientists. They say it's just probability. It's just probability that in a universe this large there are other forms of life. And I think, in order to ascertain a probability, you need to know literally anything about the topic that you're describing. And when it comes to how life begins, we actually know nothing. There are half a dozen prominent theories, none of which are particularly persuasive. And so when it comes to the little green men, I'm not holding my breath.
Not
Amen.
holding your breath.
Amen.
All right.
Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, Speechless by Michael Knowles. I highly recommend. I'm 6 chapters in. Highly recommend. It's an excellent book. It's worth it just for the bibliography at the back alone and the glossary of woke terms to you, because you never know what people are talking about nowadays. And this is better than looking at Urban Dictionary. So I highly recommend getting his book for that alone, but it's a great book. I highly recommend.
All right. Praise be to God. Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire and the Michael Knowles Show. God bless you. God love you. Thank you for your time today.
Gentlemen, great to be with you. I look forward to talking to you again.
Praise
If
be
you
to
like
God.
that interview, then be sure to check out some of our other interviews that you might find fascinating. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share this interview with someone that you think will find this informative and inspiring. God love you.